Welcome to the ACI Learning Leadership Series. I'm your host, Daniel Lowry, and today we're going to be talking about cybersecurity and the questions that board members, execs, C-suite people should be asking about cybersecurity. Joining me today is none other than Wes Spencer, the founder and CEO of Empath Cyber. Wes, I'm so glad to have you today, brother. I've had a great time talking to you before, and you know a lot about a lot. So having you today is going to be very helpful for all of us involved. How's things going, and are you ready?
This is one of my favorite topics on earth to talk about. So let's just dive right in. I'm pumped.
You know, it's one of my favorite topics as well, because it seems like the people that run companies would know a thing or two about a thing or two, and they do, but they also have their fingers in a lot of pies. They got a lot of irons in the fire. It's hard for them to know everything about everything. And when it comes to cybersecurity, that can be even more difficult because there's so much changing on a rapid basis that it's difficult to stay on top of these things. So that becomes, what are those really pointed, important things, those main veins that they got to keep their finger on the pulse of when it comes to cybersecurity? And I think we'll just start with that topic in general. When you hear that question, what's the first thing that pops into your head?
You know, as a business owner myself, we care about one thing: business outcomes. Like that is what matters more than anything else. And this is a challenge for us as MSPs, because if we step in the shoes of the MSP, sometimes we're not thinking like that. And so we tend to go towards the technical. Did you know your firewall had this many, alerts that were stopped from China? Did you know that your email system had this many malicious PDFs that we blocked? They're like, well, I don't really care about that because I don't know what a PDF, like a malicious PDF is. And moreover, like, how does that affect my business? All you're doing is telling me stuff you stopped, but like, I don't understand what that gives me. And so, where we need to focus, like, I literally created the name of my business, Empath Cyber, off of this topic right here: empathy, stepping into the shoes of the business owner. So they think about business outcomes, and they think about, from a high level, what's going to keep my business from operating? What are the things that are going to shut me down? When they wake up in the middle of the night, what they're concerned with is what's going to stop me from doing what I'm doing, from building my business and getting it to the growth levels it wants to be. And so as MSPs, we got to seize into that. We got to step across that bridge to their reality and to their concerns and get there. Now, here's the challenge. The challenge comes in when we start having this conversation and we say, hey, Miss Client, what are the things that you care about? Like, I'll just flip the question you asked me to the client. And the client says, well, I don't know. You tell me. I don't know what's important. And we're like, what do we talk about? So here's some of the things I would do. I would start the conversation with making sure that the client understands why this matters, right? Like, taking the challenger sales method of teach, tailor, take control. So if we're not teachers first, we're never going to be able to tailor the conversation to them. If we're not tailoring the conversation, then we'll never take control of where we want this thing to go. So we start with teaching. We help them understand this is what the world looks like around us. Here's the cost of a breach. Here are some of the things that happen when our business comes to a grinding halt, when we're not able to fulfill our orders, when we're not able to generate revenue, when we have some of our best clients coming after us, barking mad and angry that things aren't working, that we have lawsuits in front of us. That's stuff that every business owner is listening to and saying, that sounds scary. I really need to make sure that doesn't happen to me. And so we tie and weave cybersecurity into that discussion. And so I think you can start there. And you can even start with, what I would do is a lot of open-ended security questions like, hey, what are some of the critical cybersecurity risks that you think that we might have? What would a cyber attack that I just described look like for your business? How would that happen for you? I'll give you one example. I was talking to a doctor and the practitioner, like the office manager. And this conversation came up with the MSP. And the doctor said, I just don't believe in this stuff. We'll just go back to paper if that happens to us. Practice manager is sitting right next to him, and she crosses her arms and she goes, oh, you don't know how this business operates, doc. That is not going to happen. That's impossible. That's not how we operate. And he goes, oh, well, okay, well, then what should we do? You see how that changes the conversation? And so that's kind of how I like to think about it at a high level when we talk about this. Tie it to business outcomes, tie it to what the business is trying to do. And then you'll notice that that gets a lot more opportunity of conversation than just jumping into a bunch of like pages and pages of technical gobbledygook that they don't understand.
That's a great set of advice. I mean, I always try to, when I'm doing any kind of instruction for cybersecurity, a lot of times I'll be explaining to my students, you really need to get buy-in from the stakeholders of the company. Anybody that has anything to do with what's going on, especially when it comes to their cybersecurity, they need to understand why that's important to them and how they can be a part of the solution and not just sit there with their assumptions thinking that everything's fine, when it's our job to know that it's not and what we can do to make it that way, at least as much as humanly possible. So I loved your answer on that about trying to find where they have some assumptions around things and how we can get them to understand what the state of reality is and how it would work out if things went wrong and what we can do to start fixing those things so that they don't go wrong. Now, that said, I have run into a lot of executives that tend to think, well, we have compliance and we checked all the boxes in compliance, therefore we are good. And then the security people tend to go, whoa there, Tex, we might not be good. We've passed compliance, but a check mark doesn't necessarily mean security. How do we get that across? How do we get that across to those executives to understand that, yes, we might be compliant, but there are other things that we should still be doing to get that security up to where it should be?
That's one of the hardest discussions because, when we talk about compliance, they think, well, that's the ceiling and I met it. So like, why are we still talking about this? I need to spend more. I need more conversations. We just hit the ceiling here. We hit compliance, the objective, that's the standard. And so what I like to do is tell folks like, hey, that's great that you are compliant. But two things. One, you're compliant right now. How do you know you're going to be compliant tomorrow? The whole objective of compliance standards is that it's a process that never ends. And so just because we're compliant right now doesn't mean we're permanently compliant. Also, more importantly, compliance never sets the ceiling. It only sets the floor. And that will get them thinking. That will get them like, oh, well, what do you mean by that? And so I think when we're talking about compliance, I come out of banking. Banking, like this is a great example of when we would finish our banking examinations and I would report to the board of directors where our bank stood. One of the things I always ended the conversation with is, hey, look, the examiners, the federal examiners that can fine us, they said we're doing great. But did you know our bank is still, when it comes to cybersecurity, our residual risk is still high? And one time, one of my bank board members said, well, why? We spent all this money. The examiners are happy. Everything's great. I'm like, well, yeah, that is, we've done the bare minimums, but we haven't done the maximums. And what I mean by that is I need you to understand as a board member that we can still be hit with a cyber attack. And if we're hit with a cyber attack, the last thing I want you to do is to look at me as your CISO and you say, Wes, how could that have happened? You told me we were compliant. Why should I not fire you for this? This is job security. And they're like, oh, okay, I get it. So I'm like, so that's why it's great to be at the minimums, but we still got more things to do. And then that brings up the question, well, what are the more things to do? And I'll close on this. I think it's a couple things. I think it's one, security frameworks. How do we know what we're doing is the right thing? Well, the way a builder builds a house, she doesn't just start building the house. They have frameworks, they have blueprints that they follow that tell them what to do. In security, we have those blueprints like the cybersecurity framework from NIST, and then also the CIS controls, of which I'm a huge fan of. And then the other thing I would say is peer analysis. How do we stack up to our peers? That needs to be a conversation that should be given in every single security conversation with non-technical leaders. How do we stack up? What are we doing that's better? What are we doing that's worse? Because if there's one thing that decision makers care about, they don't want to be behind their competition. So we've got to spice that in and help them understand you're doing great over here, but probably could work over here in some areas to get you up to best practice standards with your peers. You see how all that goes way past compliance? And it really helps set that conversation threshold that compliance is the floor, not the ceiling.
I love the idea of that keeping up with the Joneses in this instance is actually a pretty good thing, right? Because start to get that competition going. It's like, well, we can't let our competitors outdo us. We'll show them. We're going to take it another step. We're going to go a little farther. We're going to go above and beyond and show them how security is really done. You kind of get that mojo working in the boardroom. That could benefit us security people who have to deal with that day in and day out and make our lives a little bit easier and keep our organizations that much safer. Now, when it comes to that board, right, when they're talking about questions in cybersecurity that comes up, let's get into the idea of what kind of questions should they be asking when it comes around defenses? Like, what are we doing? What are the specific things? What kind of questions should they be asking around that topic?
Yeah, there's raw materials and there's finished goods in this conversation, right? So in other words, if we're talking about the national budget, how many of us know at the national level all the minute things that are going into that budget, all of the different areas where money is flowing in and out? None of us. But we all know, are we on track? Are we blowing our budget out as an economy? Are we headed for bankruptcy and recession, or are things going well? These are high level questions that are systemic indicators that we want to look at a high level. And then if we need to drill in downward to the data, it exists. And this is how you approach it when we talk about this whole thing. So I'll give you an example of all of this, right? One of the things I might want to know is what's some of our yellow, green, red levels of like, where are we doing well? Where are we doing poorly? So maybe one of those things could be security awareness training. Are all our employees training? Have they hit a certain threshold of training minimums? Let's say you say, I want to have no higher than a 10% phishing failure rate, and I want to test monthly. Well, we can turn that into a KPI that shows green, yellow, red. And now the board's like, cool, we're green. I don't really need to know much more about it. I just know we've hit our thresholds and our standards that we've set for ourselves. So if we hit yellow or red, that's probably a talking point. Same thing with our EDR. I mentioned that in a different podcast episode. Like EDRs are really important for understanding what's happening in the world around us. How many alerts are we having? How long is it taking for those alerts before we respond to them and close them out? Those can be yellow, green, red types of gauges that really show us kind of where we're at and how we're stacking up. You can turn those same things into how does that compare with your other clients that you work with? Are they typically in the red with those same numbers and you're in the green, or vice versa? So what you can do is you can take a lot of raw data, and hear me, as a CISO, as a nerd, the raw data is what gets us going, right? But the raw data should be presented carefully to a board to where we're not overwhelming them with data that they don't know of. How many board members know things like mean time to respond and mean time to detect and phishing click-through rates? Like, they don't know any of that stuff. But what they do know is if we have a threshold of a lot of that, and it's not been dealt with correctly, that might be a yellow level or a red level that we want to talk about. And here's what's so cool about it. Once you get to those yellows and reds, don't be afraid of them. Use those as opportunity to say, this is trending into yellow. And if we don't take care of this, we're going to be in the red pretty soon. And this is going to be bad because remember I talked about if we're slow to respond, that something bad could really happen. And remember we talked about how expensive this is? Yes. Well, we need to put a budget in the next 3 months to switch I'll use EDR again, to switch our EDR to a managed solution that somebody's watching over this 24/7, 365. It's a little bit more expensive, but you see how we're really trending negatively here? We got to course correct that now. What's the client going to say? Okay, I get it. That makes sense. I'm not thrilled about it, but let's do it. That's how we handle risk. That's how we handle these discussions. That's how we bring data in the right way into our client conversations to enact change for them instead of blowing them up with, did you know you had 14, EDR alerts that were critical level that have hit the desktop that are, they're just not going to get it. So that's how you go through those discussions.
Yeah. And it really seems like this question and answer really dovetails into the idea of strategy. We really it seems like we want to take that technical information that we love as nerds and present it to them in a way where they can effectively use that to strategize the company, even though that seems like oil and water, honestly. How do those two things connect, and how do we effectively make that happen?
My nephew was visiting us a couple years ago and was in for 2 months with our family, and he started getting really sick, and we didn't understand what was happening. And 2 weeks went by, and then finally things hit the fan, and he just couldn't walk and he couldn't get up, and we just went through this panic moment. We rushed him to the ER. Actually, UF Shands, I think you guys are over in Gainesville, and the doctors took action right away and discovered that he had type 1 diabetes. We had no idea because nobody in our family's ever had type 1 diabetes. And so we're working through this whole thing. We're calling his mom and dad. Everything's okay. We got this thing under control. Doc comes in and he gives us this big old paper of all these test results. And he's trying to talk to us about it. I finally interrupted him. I'm like, hey, Doc. I'm like, thank you for doing the hard work here. I'm confident that you know what's going on. I'm confident that you have him under control. But look, in a couple of days, he's going to come home with us. And I have this big list of all this gobbledygook here. I don't know what to do about it. Can you just point to me the things that matter? He's like, oh, yeah, I can do that. You should have said. He's like, see this number here? You need to care about this. If this number goes above here or below there, you need to do this. And this is the testing that you need to do on a continual basis. I'm like, okay, cool. Those 3 things, I got it. That makes sense. Why am I saying that? I'm saying in security, we must do the same thing. That's what gets them to move. That's what gets them to understand. That's what gets them to care. Boil your security down of all the rich raw data that you have to prove that you're worth your salt. Boil that down to the board in ways that create action, ways that help them understand, and things that they can say that makes sense from a trend perspective. And we do want to augment for this. We do want to address that. We do want to accept this risk over here. That's how you get into the strategic discussions. They don't want themselves to do your job. If you give them all the raw data, all you're telling them is, hey, do you do the job for me? What they're saying, what they want to say is, I'm paying you to do this job. Just show me the data that matters. Give me the 3 things that I need to know to act on. I trust that you're doing all the rest of that stuff. That's how we get into a strategic discussion. Just like a CFO doesn't drown people in all of their Excel spreadsheets, they come back with the high level financial markers. We're on track to this budget, all those kind of things. So that's how you have that conversation. And I promise you, you start getting to that level with them, they'll never leave you. They'll always see that you're a critical component and you belong in the boardroom, not the server room. And that's kind of how we get that discussion across.
Wow. Wes, they say that wisdom is basically the summation of knowledge and experience. And obviously you've had quite a bit of both of those together in your career. So thank you so much for sharing those words of wisdom with us on how we can help our execs and our board members to help them strategize and understand cybersecurity and figure out what questions should they be asking their teams when it comes to cybersecurity. It's definitely something that's well needed in today's world. That said, we are out of time for this episode. We do thank everybody for watching. Hopefully you got a lot out of this. And until next time, have a great day.